Sometimes the hardest thing to witness isn't cruelty. It's watching good people suffer while the world just walks on by. In the bitter winter of 1883, two sisters sat behind a saloon in a small Montana town, picking through scraps just to make it through another day. One was a widow who'd lost everything. The other was her younger sister, too proud to beg but too hungry to refuse. Most people passed them without a second glance. But when Caleb Stone, a quiet mountain man, came down from his cabin that afternoon, he stopped. He saw them, and something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. What happened next was simple, but it changed all three of their lives forever. What makes a stranger decide to save someone he doesn't even know? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Stone had lived alone in the Montana mountains for 8 years, and he preferred it that way. His cabin sat tucked into a valley where the pines grew thick, and the nearest neighbor was a half-day's ride. The silence suited him. It asked nothing of him, expected nothing from him, and most importantly, it never reminded him of what he'd lost. The cabin itself was modest but solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd cut and hauled himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising straight and true. The floors were hewn planks, worn smooth by his boots over the years. A single bedroom occupied the back, though Caleb rarely used it anymore, preferring to sleep in the main room near the fire. The bed in that room had been built for two, and he couldn't bring himself to lie in it alone. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a worn leather Bible, untouched for years, its pages gathering dust. It had belonged to his wife, Margaret. She'd read from it every evening before bed, her soft voice filling their home with words of comfort and faith. After she died, Caleb had placed it there and never opened it again. Some things hurt too much to hold. He kept his life simple now, trapping in winter, hunting year-round, tending a small garden in the warmer months. Once a month, he made the long trip down to Bent Creek for supplies: salt, flour, coffee, ammunition. He spoke to the shopkeeper, paid his bills, and left. The town had learned not to expect conversation from Caleb Stone. But he hadn't always been this way. Before the fever took Margaret and their daughter, before grief hollowed him out and left him empty, Caleb had been different. He'd been a cavalry officer in the war, decorated for valor. After Appomattox, he'd come west with dreams of building something lasting. He'd bought land, built a ranch, married a good woman. For a few years, life had been everything he'd hoped for. Then, in the space of 2 weeks, it all ended. The fever came sudden and merciless. First little Sarah, only 4 years old. Then Margaret, 3 days later. Caleb had buried them both on a hillside overlooking the valley, sold the ranch for whatever he could get, and disappeared into the mountains. That was 8 years ago. The winter of 1883 came hard and early. By November, snow already lay thick on the ground, and the wind carried a bite that promised worse to come. Caleb made his monthly trip to Bent Creek on a grey afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy. The town looked smaller every time he visited, or perhaps he just cared less about it. Bent Creek had sprung up during the gold rush days, though the gold had played out years ago. Now it survived on ranching, timber, and the few stubborn souls who refused to admit the boom times were over. The main street consisted of a general store, a saloon, a hotel that had seen better days, a church, and a scattering of other buildings in various states of repair. Maybe 200 people called it home, though that number seemed to shrink each year. Caleb tied his horse outside Guthrie's general store and went inside. Henry Guthrie stood behind the counter, same as always. his apron stained with the day's work. "Caleb," Henry said with a nod. "Usual supplies. Same as always." While Henry gathered the items, Caleb's eyes wandered to the pot-bellied stove in the corner where 3 old-timers sat playing checkers. They glanced at him but said nothing. Caleb had a reputation for not welcoming small talk. He paid for his goods, loaded them into his saddlebags, and was preparing to leave when he noticed the commotion near the saloon across the street. A small crowd had gathered, their voices raised in what sounded like argument or mockery. Caleb normally would have ignored it and ridden out, but something made him pause. Through the cluster of people, he caught a glimpse of 2 women sitting on the ground near the saloon's back entrance. Even from a distance, he could see they were in poor condition, thin, ragged, hunched against the cold. One appeared older, maybe in her late 20s. The other looked younger, perhaps barely 20. "That's Sarah Mitchell and her sister," Henry said, following Caleb's gaze. He'd come to stand in the doorway. "Sad business, that." Caleb said nothing, waiting. "Sarah's husband died about 4 months back. Charles Mitchell. You might have seen him around. Gambler mostly. Not a successful one." Henry shook his head. "Left her with nothing but debts. The bank took their house. Her family back east wanted nothing to do with the shame of it all. So there she is, her and her sister Emma, trying to survive however they can. They begging? Too proud for that, I think. They pick through scraps behind the restaurants, do odd jobs when they can find them. Sleep in that old abandoned barn at the edge of town. It's not right, but—" Henry shrugged. "What can you do?" "She made her choices, marrying a man like that." Caleb felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Anger, perhaps, or recognition. He remembered what it felt like to lose everything, to have the world move on while you drowned. He watched as a man from the crowd kicked dirt toward the women, laughing. The older one, Sarah, pulled her sister closer, turning her back to shield her from further humiliation. They didn't fight back, didn't protest. They just endured. "She wasn't always like this," Henry continued. "Sarah was a school teacher before she married. Proper woman, educated. Emma's got a talent for drawing, I hear. But that doesn't put food on the table." Caleb turned away from the scene and mounted his horse. But he didn't ride out of town. Instead, he guided his horse down the street, staying back, watching. He told himself he was just curious, that it didn't concern him. But he kept watching. As the afternoon wore on and the temperature dropped, he saw Sarah and Emma turned away from the general store when they tried to ask for work. He saw them approach the hotel, only to be dismissed before they could finish speaking. He saw the town treat them like they were invisible, or worse, like they were a nuisance to be shooed away. When evening came and the light began to fail, Caleb watched them make their way toward the old barn at the edge of town. They walked slowly, the younger one leaning on her sister for support. Even from a distance, he could see they were struggling. He should leave. He should ride back to his cabin and forget what he'd seen. It wasn't his business. These people had made their own choices, faced their own consequences. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't save everyone, that sometimes you couldn't save anyone at all. But as he sat there on his horse in the gathering darkness, watching 2 women disappear into a drafty barn with nothing but each other, Caleb thought about the worn Bible sitting on his shelf at home. He thought about Margaret reading from it, about the passages she'd loved. Something about mercy. Something about the least of these. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who would have been 12 years old now if she'd lived. He thought about how he'd failed to save her, failed to save Margaret. Maybe he couldn't change the past. Maybe he couldn't bring back what he'd lost. But he could do something about what was right in front of him. Caleb turned his horse toward the barn and rode slowly forward, his mind made up, even as doubt whispered at the edges of his thoughts. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd come back. Tomorrow he'd do something he hadn't done in 8 years. Tomorrow he'd let someone in. Caleb returned to town the next morning with a purpose that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. The sky remained overcast, threatening more snow, and his breath misted in the cold air as he rode down Bent Creek's main street. He'd barely slept, his mind turning over what he was about to do and whether he had any right to do it. He found them behind the saloon again, in almost the same spot as yesterday. This time there was no crowd, no mockery, just 2 women trying to salvage something edible from the previous night's waste. The sight struck him harder in the quiet morning light. The older one, Sarah, knelt in the dirt, carefully examining scraps, while her sister Emma sat against the building's wall, her face pale and drawn. Caleb dismounted and stood there for a moment, uncertain how to approach. He'd spent 8 years avoiding human connection, and now he was about to thrust himself into the lives of 2 strangers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah noticed him first. She looked up, and her body tensed immediately. The instinctive wariness of someone who'd learned that men appearing out of nowhere rarely brought good news. She stood slowly, positioning herself between Caleb and her sister. "We're not causing trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We'll move along if you need us to." "I'm not here to move you along," Caleb said. He shifted his weight, feeling awkward. "I'm here to help." Sarah's expression didn't soften. "We don't need charity." "Didn't say it was charity." Caleb glanced at Emma, who was watching him with hollow eyes. "But your sister looks like she needs a doctor." "We can't afford a doctor," Sarah said flatly. "Didn't ask if you could afford one. I'm saying she needs one." Sarah's jaw tightened. Pride, Caleb recognized. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. The kind of pride that would rather starve than accept help. The kind that held you together when everything else was falling apart. "We'll manage," Sarah said. Emma made a small sound, almost a whimper, and then her eyes rolled back. She slumped sideways, and Sarah lunged to catch her before she hit the ground. Caleb moved instinctively, crossing the space in 3 long strides. Together, they lowered Emma gently to the ground. "Emma," Sarah said urgently, patting her sister's face. "Emma, wake up." But Emma didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold to the touch. Caleb had seen this before. Starvation, exposure, the body finally giving out after being pushed too far for too long. "She needs warmth and food," Caleb said. "Now. Not tomorrow. Not later today. Now." Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time, the wall she'd built around herself cracked. He saw the terror beneath the pride, the desperation she'd been holding back. "I don't have anywhere to take her." "I do." Before Sarah could protest, Caleb scooped Emma up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like carrying a child. The realization made his chest tighten. "My wagon's at the general store. We need to get her warm. Wait, I can't just... We don't even know you." Caleb turned to face Sarah fully. "Name's Caleb Stone. I live about 2 hours north in the mountains. I've got a cabin, food, a fire. Your sister needs all 3 of those things, and she needs them now. You can come with me, or you can stay here, but I'm taking her either way, because if she spends another night in that barn, she's going to die. You know it, and I know it." Sarah stared at him, her mind clearly racing through options she didn't have. Caleb could see the calculation in her eyes. the risk of trusting a stranger versus the certainty of what would happen if she didn't. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you do this for people you don't know?" Caleb looked down at Emma's unconscious face, so young and pale. "Because someone should have done it yesterday. Because it's the right thing to do." "That enough?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I'm coming with you, but if you try anything, I won't." They walked to the general store where Caleb had left his wagon. Henry Guthrie stood in the doorway, watching with undisguised curiosity as Caleb gently laid Emma in the wagon bed and arranged blankets around her. "Caleb Stone playing Good Samaritan," Henry said. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Send Doc Morrison to my place if he's willing to make the trip," Caleb said, ignoring the commentary. "I'll pay him double his usual rate." "Your place? You're taking them to your cabin?" "That's right." Henry's eyebrows rose. "People are going to talk, Caleb. A man alone with 2 women. Let them talk." Caleb helped Sarah into the wagon seat. "They've been talking already, and it hasn't helped these ladies any. Maybe it's time somebody did something instead of just running their mouth." He climbed onto the seat beside Sarah and took up the reins. As they pulled away, Caleb caught sight of several townspeople watching from windows and doorways. He could already imagine the gossip spreading like wildfire. The hermit mountain man taking in 2 destitute women. The scandal of it. The impropriety. He didn't care. The ride to the cabin was mostly silent. Sarah kept turning to check on her sister, and Caleb focused on getting them there as quickly as the terrain would allow. The wagon bounced over frozen ruts, and Caleb tried to avoid the worst of them for Emma's sake. About halfway there, Sarah finally spoke. "I need to tell you something. About our situation. You don't owe me explanations." "Yes, I do. If you're taking us in, you should know what you're getting into." She took a breath. "My husband, Charles, he died 4 months ago. Heart gave out, the doctor said, but I think it was the drinking that really did it. He left debts, a lot of them. The bank took our house to cover what they could, but there's still more owed." "To who?" "Different people. Shopkeepers mostly. Some card players from the saloon." She paused. "I tried to pay them back. I worked as much as I could. But no one wants to hire a woman with a reputation as a gambler's widow. They think I'll steal, or that I'm somehow tainted by association. Emma and I, we've been trying to earn enough to leave, to start somewhere fresh. But..." She stopped, her voice catching. "But you can't earn money when no one will give you work," Caleb finished. "Exactly." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. "I sold everything we had. Furniture, clothes, anything with any value. All except this." She pulled something from her pocket. A simple gold wedding ring. Even in the grey daylight, it gleamed softly. "Last thing of value I own," she said quietly. "I was going to sell it this morning. There's a shopkeeper who said he'd give me $5 for it. It's worth at least 20, but beggars can't be choosers." She laughed bitterly. "I was going to buy food and medicine for Emma. Try to get her strong enough to travel." "Keep the ring," Caleb said, "but keep it. You'll need it less at my place than you will if you're trying to survive in town." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "I don't understand you, Mr. Stone. Men don't just help women like us without expecting something in return. I expect you to help around the cabin. Cooking, mending, whatever needs doing. I expect your sister to rest and get well. And I expect you both to stay as long as you need to, until you're ready to figure out what comes next." He glanced at her. "That's all I expect." "What if we can't pay you back?" Did I ask for payment? No, but then there's nothing to pay back. You'll work for your keep. That's fair enough. Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go. They rode in silence for a while longer. Finally, as the cabin came into view through the trees, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Whatever happens, whatever comes of this, thank you. Caleb nodded but said nothing. Thanks made him uncomfortable. He wasn't doing this for gratitude. He wasn't even entirely sure why he was doing it at all, except that something in him couldn't walk away. Couldn't leave them to freeze and starve while he sat warm and fed in his cabin. Maybe it was guilt over the ones he couldn't save. Maybe it was the memory of Margaret reading from that dusty Bible about loving your neighbor. Maybe it was just that 8 years of silence and solitude had finally worn thin. Or maybe, he thought, as he pulled the wagon up to his cabin, maybe it was simply time to be human again. He lifted Emma from the wagon, still unconscious, and carried her toward the door. Sarah followed close behind, and for the first time in 8 years, Caleb Stone brought people home. 6 weeks into their stay, the routine had become something more than routine. It had become life. The cabin that once echoed with emptiness now hummed with activity. Sarah's touch was everywhere. Curtains she'd sewn from spare fabric, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a corner reorganized for Emma's art supplies. The space had transformed from a hermit's shelter into a home. Caleb found himself working alongside Sarah more and more. She'd insisted on helping with the outdoor chores once the weather improved slightly, and he'd stopped arguing. They fell into an easy partnership. He'd chop wood, she'd stack it. He'd hunt, she'd preserve the meat. He'd mend the fence around his small garden plot. She'd plan what to plant come spring. It was during one of these working sessions that Caleb realized how much he'd come to depend on her presence. Not just for the work, but for the conversation, the companionship. Sarah was different from Margaret, more reserved in some ways, more weathered by hardship. But she had a quiet strength that he admired. She didn't complain, didn't waste words, but when she spoke, she said things worth hearing. "Tell me about your land," Sarah said one afternoon, as they worked on repairing the garden fence. "Henry Guthrie mentioned you own quite a bit." Caleb paused, hammer in hand. 200 acres, give or take. Bought it after the war with my military pay and what I'd saved. Sarah's eyes widened. 200 acres? Caleb, that's a fortune. It's land, most of it's timber and mountain. Good for hunting, not much else. Still, you could ranch it, farm portions of it. With that much land, you could build something substantial. Could have, Caleb said. Planned to once. Had a place started before. He stopped, the old pain still there. Doesn't matter. That was a different life. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "It could be this life. You don't have to stay frozen in the past." "I'm not frozen." "Aren't you?" She met his eyes steadily. "You've got all this land, all this potential, and you're living in a cabin built for one, working just enough to survive." "That's not living, Caleb. That's hiding." Her words stung because they were true. Caleb turned back to his work, driving a nail harder than necessary. "Maybe hiding was all I could manage." "Was," Sarah said. "Past tense. But maybe it doesn't have to be anymore." That evening, Caleb pulled out the land deed from the metal box where he kept his important papers. He hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't wanted to face what it represented, all the dreams he'd abandoned, all the potential he'd let wither. The deed was official and proper, signed and sealed by the territorial government. 214 acres, to be precise, stretching from his current cabin site up into the mountains and down into a valley with a creek running through it. Good water, good timber, good grazing land in the lower elevations, worth a considerable sum if he ever wanted to sell. But he'd never wanted to sell. Even in his grief, even in his isolation, he'd held on to the land. Some part of him must have known he might need it again someday. Emma wandered over, curious. What's that? Land deed. Legal papers showing what I own. She peered at it, then looked up with surprise. Caleb, this says 200 acres. You own all of this? That's right. But why live so simply when you could? She stopped, understanding dawning. You were waiting? For what? For a reason to build something again. For people to build it for. Caleb folded the deed carefully. Maybe. Maybe I just got used to simple. But Emma shook her head, smiling. No, Sarah's right. You were waiting, and now you have us. The words should have felt presumptuous, but they didn't. They felt true. In 6 weeks, these 2 women had become part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. He thought of them when he was out checking traps. He hurried home instead of lingering in the woods. He planned for their comfort, their needs, their futures. When had that happened? When had they stopped being charity cases and started being family? A few days later, Caleb made another trip to town. The gossip had grown in his absence. Wild speculation about what was happening up at his cabin, about the nature of his relationship with the Mitchell women. He heard snippets of it as he walked through town. Scandalous, inappropriate. That poor widow falling in with a recluse. Henry Guthrie was more direct. People are talking, Caleb, saying it's not proper, you living up there with 2 unmarried women. People should mind their own business. I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm saying you should be aware. There are those who think Sarah's trading one bad situation for another, if you catch my meaning. Caleb's jaw tightened. Anyone who thinks that doesn't know me, and doesn't know Sarah. We're helping each other survive the winter. Nothing improper about it. I know that. But reputation matters, especially for women. Sarah's already been through enough. If this damages her standing further... Her standing? Caleb's voice rose. She was sleeping in a barn and eating scraps. How much lower could her standing get? At least now she's warm and fed and safe. If people want to gossip about that, let them. Still, the conversation bothered him. He'd been so focused on the practical aspects of helping Sarah and Emma that he hadn't considered how it looked to others. A widow and her sister, living with a bachelor. In frontier society, such arrangements were viewed with suspicion at best, moral outrage at worst. When he returned to the cabin, he found Sarah in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour from making bread. She looked up when he entered, and something in his face must have shown his thoughts. What happened in town? Nothing important. Caleb. He sighed and told her about the conversation with Henry, about the gossip spreading through Bent Creek. Sarah listened quietly, her expression unreadable. I see, she said when he finished. I suppose I should have expected this. It doesn't matter what they think. It does, though. Not to me, particularly. I stopped caring what Bent Creek thinks of me when they let us starve. But it matters for you. You have to live here, trade here. I won't have our presence damage your reputation. My reputation can handle it. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, thinking. Perhaps Emma and I should move on. Spring's coming. We're both stronger now. We could travel to a bigger town, somewhere we're not known. Start fresh. The suggestion hit Caleb like a physical blow. The thought of them leaving, of the cabin returning to its empty silence, was unbearable. No, he said, more forcefully than he intended. You're not going anywhere. Not until you're ready. Not until you want to. I don't care what the town thinks. But Caleb, Sarah, listen to me. He stepped closer, surprising himself with his intensity. These past 6 weeks they've mattered. You and Emma being here has mattered. This cabin's been a tomb for 8 years, and you brought it back to life. I'm not ready to lose that. Not because of gossip, not because of what some narrow-minded people think about propriety. Sarah's eyes searched his face. What are you saying? I'm saying stay. Stay as long as you want. Help me plant that garden. Help me figure out what to do with 200 acres of possibility. Let Emma sell her art and save enough to go to that school she dreams about. Let yourself have time to heal, to plan your next step without starving while you do it. People will talk. Let them talk. Sarah moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the bread dough and wood smoke that clung to her clothes. You're a good man, Caleb Stone, the best I've ever known. I'm just a man trying to do right by people he's come to care about. Come to care about, Sarah repeated softly. I've come to care about you too, about this place, about the life we're building here, strange as it is. They stood there in the kitchen, the moment stretching between them, heavy with things unsaid. Then Emma called from the other room, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart. But something had changed. Something had been acknowledged, even if not fully spoken. And as Caleb went about his evening chores, he felt the weight of that land deed in his pocket, differently than before. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to build something again. The next storm came 3 days later, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that trapped them all inside. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet beyond the windows, and the wind howled like something alive and angry. Caleb secured the livestock in the barn and made sure they had enough firewood stacked inside to last several days. Storms like this can last a while, he told Sarah as he shook snow from his coat. We might be cabin-bound for some time. We have enough supplies, plenty, and each other for company. The words came out lighter than he intended, almost playful, and Sarah smiled. These small moments of ease between them had become more frequent, the careful distance they'd maintained slowly shrinking. The first day of the storm, they kept to their usual routines as much as possible. Emma drew by the window, capturing the wild beauty of the blizzard. Sarah mended clothes and sorted through dried goods. Caleb worked on a chair that needed repairs. But by evening, the enforced closeness had created a different atmosphere, more intimate, more connected. They gathered by the fire after supper, the wind rattling the shutters, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb found himself telling stories he hadn't thought about in years, tales from his time in the cavalry, the places he'd seen, the men he'd served with. You were a captain? Emma asked, fascinated. That's quite a rank. I was decent at tactics, better at understanding what men needed to stay focused under pressure. He paused. The war was a long time ago. Different life. You say that a lot, Sarah observed. Different life, as if you're not the same person who lived it. Maybe I'm not. War changes a man. So does loss. Sarah leaned forward, her face serious in the firelight. Tell me about her, your wife, if you want to. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He'd spent 8 years not talking about Margaret, keeping that pain locked away where it couldn't touch him. But something about the storm, about being enclosed in this warm space with people who cared, made him want to open that door. Her name was Margaret Ann. She was a preacher's daughter from Ohio. came west with her family after the war. I met her at a church social. I'd been dragged there by a friend who thought I needed civilizing. He smiled at the memory. She had red hair and opinions about everything, not shy about sharing them either. Sounds like she kept you on your toes, Emma said. That she did. We married after knowing each other 6 months. Everyone said it was too fast, but it felt right. We built a ranch together, worked side by side. Then Sarah came along. His voice softened. Our daughter. Named her after my mother. She had Margaret's red hair and her spirit. Fearless little thing, always getting into everything. Sarah reached over and touched his hand gently. What happened to them? Fever came through in the summer of 75. Moved fast. Sarah got sick first. Then Margaret caught it while nursing her. I rode for the doctor, brought him back, but... He stopped, the old helplessness washing over him. They were gone in a week, both of them. And I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. That's not on you, Sarah said firmly. You can't fight illness with willpower or love. You did everything you could. Did I? Sometimes I wonder. Maybe if I'd gotten the doctor sooner. Maybe if I'd moved them to town where he could watch them closer. No. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened. I've walked that road, Caleb. The what-ifs and maybes that eat you alive. My husband died of a heart condition no one knew he had. I spent months wondering if I'd missed signs, if I should have forced him to see a doctor more often, if maybe the stress of his gambling was my fault for not being a better wife. But that's just grief, looking for someone to blame, and the easiest target is always yourself. Caleb looked at their joined hands, at the compassion in Sarah's eyes. How did you get past it? I'm not sure I have, but I've learned to carry it differently. The guilt, the grief, it's part of me now, but it doesn't have to be all of me. Emma, watching them both, quietly stood and slipped into the bedroom, giving them privacy. The gesture was subtle but deliberate. Alone now by the fire, Caleb and Sarah sat in silence for a while. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside, everything felt still and peaceful. I want to show you something, Caleb said. He went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down the worn leather Bible he'd avoided for years. Dust fell from it as he opened it carefully. Margaret read from this every night. I haven't touched it since she died. Sarah took the Bible gently, reverently. On the inside cover, written in careful script, were names and dates, a family record. Margaret Ann Stone, born 1848, married to Caleb Stone, 1867. Sarah Elizabeth Stone, born 1871, died 1875. Margaret Ann Stone, died 1875. Below that, in Margaret's handwriting, was a verse. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. She believed that, Caleb said quietly, believed in mercy and new beginnings. I stopped believing after she died. Stopped believing in much of anything except pain. Sarah closed the Bible and held it out to him. Maybe it's time to believe again. Maybe. He took the Bible but didn't return it to the shelf. Instead, he placed it on the table between them. I've been thinking about what you said, about not being frozen anymore, about building something. And I think you're right. I think... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think maybe I was just waiting for a reason, for people who made it worth the effort. Caleb. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. Sarah recognized it immediately from his earlier descriptions, his wife's locket, one of the few things he'd kept. I want you to have this, he said, placing it in her palm. I can't. This belonged to Margaret. It's precious to you. It is. but she would have wanted it to go to someone who understood its value. Someone who knew what it meant to love and lose and find the courage to keep going. He closed Sarah's fingers around the locket. She would have liked you, would have approved. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. This is too much. It's not nearly enough for what you've given me. You and Emma, you brought me back to life. Let me give you something that matters in return. Sarah opened the locket. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, Margaret and little Sarah, beautifully rendered. She traced them with her finger, then looked up at Caleb with such tenderness that it took his breath away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." Outside, the storm raged. On, but inside the cabin, something profound had shifted. 2 broken people had found in each other not a replacement for what they'd lost, but a possibility for what might come. The past would always be part of them, but it no longer had to define them. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate sleeping spaces, both lay awake for a long time, thinking about silver lockets and worn Bibles, about mercy and new beginnings, about how sometimes the most unexpected gifts come wrapped in the strangest circumstances. The storm would pass, spring would come, and when it did, they would be ready to build something new together. Spring arrived gradually, melting the snow and revealing the brown earth beneath. Caleb and Sarah began planning the garden in earnest, mapping out where to plant vegetables, discussing which crops would do best in the mountain soil. Emma's artwork was selling steadily in town, and she'd saved nearly $40, a small fortune that brought her closer to her dream of art school. Life had found a rhythm, a purpose. The 3 of them worked together like a family, and more, Caleb caught himself thinking of them that way. He'd even begun to imagine a future where this arrangement became permanent, where Sarah might... He didn't let himself finish the thought. Too much hope was dangerous. It was a Tuesday morning in early April when the stranger arrived. Caleb was outside splitting wood when he heard the horse approaching. Visitors were rare enough that he set down his axe and waited, wary. The man who rode up was well dressed for the frontier, a suit that had seen better days but was still respectable, polished boots, a leather satchel hung from his saddle. He had the look of someone who worked with papers and numbers rather than his hands. "Mr. Caleb Stone?" the man asked, dismounting. "That's right. What's your business?" "My name is Edmund Pierce. I'm an attorney from Bent Creek, representing Mr. Clayton Murdoch." He pulled a document from his satchel. "I have legal papers regarding Mrs. Sarah Mitchell." Caleb's stomach tightened. "What kind of papers?" "Perhaps we should discuss this inside, with Mrs. Mitchell present." Sarah had appeared at the door, alerted by the voices. When she saw the attorney, her face went pale. "What's happened?" "Mrs. Mitchell, if we could speak inside." "Say what you came to say," Caleb interrupted. "No need for formalities." Pierce sighed and opened the document. "Very well. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm here on behalf of my client, Clayton Murdoch, who holds legal claim to debts incurred by your late husband, Charles Mitchell. The total amount, with accrued interest, comes to $2,000. $2,000? Sarah's voice shook. "That's impossible. Charles's debts were paid. The bank took our house." "The bank's debt was paid, yes. But Mr. Murdoch held private debts, gambling losses, personal loans. Your husband signed promissory notes, all properly, witnessed and notarized." Pierce handed her several papers. "As you can see, everything is legal and binding." Sarah took the papers with trembling hands, scanning them. Caleb moved to her side, looking over her shoulder. The documents appeared legitimate. Charles Mitchell's signature on loan agreements, dates going back 2 years before his death. "I never knew about these," Sarah whispered. Ignorance of debt doesn't nullify it, I'm afraid. Under territorial law, a widow inherits her husband's debts along with his assets. Since there were no assets, the debt transfers to you personally. She can't pay $2,000, Caleb said flatly. She has nothing. I'm aware, which is why Mr. Murdoch has generously offered alternative arrangements. Pierce pulled out another document. Option 1. Mrs. Mitchell can work off the debt through 7 years of indentured servitude to Mr. Murdoch's household. Option 2. He paused delicately. Mr. Murdoch is willing to forgive the debt entirely if Mrs. Mitchell agrees to marry him. The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah swayed slightly, and Caleb gripped her arm to steady her. This is extortion, Caleb said, his voice dangerous. This is law, Mr. Stone. Territorial statute clearly states that creditors have rights to collect debts through labor or, in certain cases, through marriage contracts when the debtor is deceased and the widow destitute. I didn't write the law, I merely enforce it. Who is Clayton Murdoch? Caleb demanded. A prominent businessman in Bent Creek. He owns the largest saloon, several properties, and holds financial interests in various enterprises. A respected member of the community. Sarah found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. I never met this man. Why would he want to marry someone he doesn't know? Pierce had the grace to look uncomfortable. Mr. Murdoch has, shall we say, admired you from afar for some time, Mrs. Mitchell, even before your husband's passing. He considers this arrangement mutually beneficial. He orchestrated this, Sarah said, sudden understanding dawning. Charles's gambling debts. Murdoch owns the saloon. He could have manipulated the situation, encouraged Charles's gambling, offered loans he knew couldn't be repaid. That's a serious accusation without proof. But it's true, isn't it? Sarah's hands clenched the papers. This was a trap. He wanted me. So he set a trap using my husband's weakness. Pierce's silence was answer enough. This can't be legal, Caleb said. A man can't force a woman into marriage through debt. In most of the United States, you'd be correct. But this is still territorial law, Mr. Stone, and it's quite archaic in some respects. Until we achieve statehood and adopt more progressive statutes, arrangements like this are perfectly legal. Distasteful, perhaps, but legal. How long do we have? Sarah asked quietly. 2 weeks to decide which option you prefer. If you choose, neither Mr. Murdoch will petition the territorial court to enforce collection, and I assure you, the judge will rule in his favor. The law is clear. Get off my property, Caleb said, his voice cold as winter. Pierce gathered his papers. I understand this is difficult, but I strongly advise Mrs. Mitchell to consider her options carefully. Mr. Murdoch is not a patient man, and 7 years of servitude is considerably harder than marriage to a wealthy man. He mounted his horse. I'll return in 2 weeks for your decision. After Pierce rode away, Sarah stood frozen, the papers still clutched in her hands. Emma had appeared during the conversation, and now stood with tears streaming down her face. Sarah, you can't, Emma said. You can't marry that man or become his servant, not after everything we've survived. I don't have a choice. There's always a choice, Caleb said firmly. We'll find a way out of this. Sarah looked at him with hollow eyes. How? The debt is legal. The law is on his side. I have no money, no prospects, nothing to fight with. You have me. Caleb, you can't fight the law. Watch me. He took the papers from her hands, studying them more carefully. There has to be a way, a loophole, something wrong with these documents, something. There isn't. I can see it in that lawyer's confidence. Murdoch has done this before, probably. He knows exactly how to work the system. Emma grabbed her sister's hands. What if we run? Leave the territory. Go somewhere they can't find us. They'd follow. A legal debt doesn't just disappear because you cross a border. And running would make it worse. They could charge me with fraud, have me arrested. Sarah pulled away, moving to the window. I should have known this wasn't over. I should have known Charles's mistakes would keep haunting us. Caleb felt fury building inside him. Rage at this Murdoch character, at the system that allowed such manipulation, at the unfairness of a woman being punished for her dead husband's sins. But anger wouldn't help Sarah. He needed to think clearly. Tell me about Murdoch, he said. What do you know about him? I've seen him around town. Older man, maybe 50. Always well dressed, always watching people. Charles went to his saloon often. Sarah's voice broke. He probably was watching me even then, planning this. What kind of businessman is he? The ruthless kind. People are afraid of him. He has connections with the territorial government, influence with the judge. Everyone has weaknesses, Caleb said. Everyone has something they want to hide. What are you thinking? I'm thinking 2 weeks is time enough to learn about Clayton Murdoch, time enough to find out if he's as clean as he pretends to be, time enough to find a way to fight back. Sarah turned to him, hope and despair warring in her expression. Caleb, you can't put yourself at risk for this. You've already done too much. I'm not letting you go. The words came out with more force than he intended. I'm not letting some predator take you because of a technicality in territorial law. You came here broken and starving, and you helped me remember how to be alive again. You think I'm going to stand by and watch you be sold like property? But what can we do? I don't know yet. But I've got resources you don't know about. Connections from my military days. Money saved up. Land that's worth something. And I've got 2 weeks to figure out how to use all of it. Emma spoke up quietly. I can sell everything I have. All my savings, all my artwork. We might need that, Caleb said. But first, I need information. I need to know everything about Murdoch. His business, his reputation, his enemies. Every man who operates like he does has enemies. He looked at both women, seeing the fear in their faces, but also seeing trust. They believed he could help them. He had to believe it too. Sarah, I need you to write down everything you remember about Charles's dealings with Murdoch. Every detail, no matter how small. Emma, I need you to sketch. Can you draw Murdoch from memory? I think so. I've seen him in town. Good. We'll need to identify him clearly. Caleb was already planning. Tomorrow, I ride to the territorial capital. I have an old friend there, someone who might be able to help, someone who understands how to fight men who hide behind the law. Who? Sarah asked. His name is Judge William Harrison. We served together in the war. He owes me his life, and he's the kind of man who remembers his debts. For the first time since Pierce had arrived, Sarah's expression showed something other than despair. You think he can help? I think he'll try. And if the law won't give us justice, we'll find another way. I promise you, Sarah, you're not going to Murdoch. Not as his wife, not as his servant. Whatever it takes, I'll keep you safe. Sarah crossed the room and embraced him, and Caleb held her close, feeling her shake with suppressed tears. Over her shoulder, he saw Emma watching them with an expression that was both heartbroken and hopeful. 2 weeks, 14 days to save a woman from a fate worse than the poverty they'd already survived. 14 days to prove that sometimes justice had to be fought for rather than waited for. Caleb had fought worse battles with less at stake. He'd find a way. He had to. Caleb left before dawn the next morning, riding hard for the territorial capital. Before he went, he pulled Sarah aside and told her something he'd kept hidden for 8 years. "There's a metal box under the floorboards in the bedroom," he said quietly, so Emma wouldn't hear. "If something happens to me, if I don't come back, it has money in it. Enough to pay Murdoch's debt and then some." "Caleb, no. Listen to me. It's my military pension, savings from when I sold the ranch, money I've had no use for all these years. I kept it buried because I didn't trust myself with it, didn't want to use it on whiskey or trying to forget. But if it can buy your freedom, it's worth more than it's ever been sitting in the ground. I won't let you bankrupt yourself for us. Sarah." He took her hands. "That money's been dead to me for 8 years. You and Emma brought me back to life. If spending every penny I have keeps you safe, that's the best use it could ever have. We'll pay you back. Somehow I don't want payment. I want you safe. I want you here." He paused, then said what he'd been thinking for weeks. "I want you to stay. Not because you have to, not because you owe me anything, but because this is home now. For all of us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Come back to us. Whatever it takes, come back." "I will." The ride to Helena took 2 days of hard travel. Caleb pushed his horse as much as he dared, stopping only when necessary. His mind raced with plans, contingencies, possibilities. He'd fought tactical battles during the war, learned to think several moves ahead. This wasn't so different, just a different kind of enemy, a different kind of battlefield. Judge William Harrison lived in a modest house on the edge of Helena. He was older now, his hair gone grey, but he still had the sharp eyes of the intelligence officer he'd been during the war. When he opened the door and saw Caleb standing there, his face split into a genuine smile. "Caleb Stone, I'll be damned. How many years has it been?" "Too many. I need your help, William." The judge's smile faded. "Come in. Tell me everything." Over coffee, Caleb laid out the situation. Sarah's predicament, Murdoch's manipulation, the legal trap with no apparent escape. Harrison listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of his face, his expression growing darker. "Clayton Murdoch," he said, when Caleb finished. "I know the name. He's been investigated twice for fraud, but nothing ever sticks. He's clever about staying just within the bounds of legality. The debt papers? Are they legitimate? If they're properly notarized and witnessed, yes. Territorial law does allow for debt collection through servitude or marriage in extreme cases. It's an old statute, meant for different circumstances, but it's still enforceable." Caleb's heart sank. "So there's nothing we can do?" "I didn't say that." Harrison leaned forward. "The law allows for these contracts, but it also has provisions. The debt must be legitimate, not fraudulent, not coerced. If we can prove Murdoch manipulated Mitchell into taking loans specifically to create this situation, that's conspiracy and fraud. How do we prove that? We need evidence. Witnesses who saw Murdoch encourage Mitchell's gambling, records of unusual loan terms, other victims, because men like Murdoch rarely do this just once. I have 1 week left." Harrison drummed his fingers on the table. "Then we work fast. I have some authority here. I can order an investigation, subpoena records. But Caleb, you need to understand. Even if we find evidence, Murdoch will fight. He'll use his money, his connections. This could get ugly. I don't care about ugly. I care about Sarah." Harrison studied him for a long moment. "You love her." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Yes." "Then we'll fight for her. You saved my life at Petersburg. Time I returned the favor." The next 5 days were a blur of activity. Harrison put his judicial authority to work, requesting records from Murdoch's businesses, interviewing people who dealt with him. Caleb worked a different angle, visiting saloons and gambling houses, talking to men who'd known Charles Mitchell. On the 3rd day, they caught their first break. A dealer at Murdoch's saloon, a man named Jack Porter, agreed to talk in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Murdoch did it deliberate, Porter said, his hands shaking as he spoke. He'd spot a man with a pretty wife or daughter, someone vulnerable to temptation. Then he'd encourage the gambling, offer easy credit, generous loans. Once the debt got big enough, he'd call it in. If they couldn't pay, and they never could, he'd offer the same deal he's offering Mrs. Mitchell. How many times? Harrison asked. At least 4 that I know of. 2 women went into servitude. 1 married him. She died within a year, some said from grief. The 4th ran away, and Murdoch had her hunted down and arrested for debt fraud. Will you testify to this? Porter hesitated. Murdoch's dangerous. He's got men who'll do anything for money. I'll protect you, Harrison promised. But I need you on record. While Harrison gathered legal ammunition, Caleb made a discovery of his own. In a boarding house in Helena, he found one of Murdoch's previous victims, a woman named Rebecca Chen, whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after accumulating massive debt to Murdoch. He killed him, Rebecca said flatly. I can't prove it, but I know. My husband was going to expose what Murdoch was doing. 2 days later, he was found dead in an alley. They said it was robbery, but his wallet was still on him. Will you tell that to a judge? What good would it do? I have no proof. But you have testimony. Add it to what we already have, and we build a pattern. Help me save another woman from what you went through. Rebecca looked at him with haunted eyes, then slowly nodded. I'll testify. By the 6th day, Harrison had compiled a case. Not perfect, but substantial. Witness testimony, financial records showing suspicious loan patterns, documentation of Murdoch's other victims. The original debt contracts also had irregularities. Some of the witnesses listed had died before the documents were supposedly signed, suggesting forgery. This is good, Harrison said, reviewing the evidence. We can challenge the contracts on the grounds of fraud. But Caleb, you need to understand, we're not just fighting Murdoch. We're fighting a corrupt system that allows men like him to operate. Even with all this, there's no guarantee. What are our chances? In a fair court, 70-30 in our favor. But this isn't a fair court. The territorial judge in Bent Creek, Judge Blackwood, is known to be friendly with Murdoch. He might rule against us despite the evidence. Then we appeal. Appeals take time. Weeks, maybe months. During that time, Sarah could be forced to comply with Blackwood's ruling. Caleb felt frustration building. So what do we do? Harrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he smiled grimly. We don't go to Blackwood. I'm a territorial judge too, with jurisdiction throughout the territory. I can hear this case in Helena, require Murdoch to come here where he has less influence. Can you do that legally? It's a grey area. But if we file the challenge to the contracts here, claim jurisdiction, because the debtor, Mrs. Mitchell, is currently residing in my district, we can make a case for it. Murdoch will scream foul, but by the time he gets it sorted out, we'll have had our hearing. Is there risk to you for doing this? Harrison shrugged. I've been on this bench for 15 years. I'm tired of watching men like Murdoch twist the law to hurt people. If this costs me my position, so be it. But it won't. I'm following legal procedure, just interpreting it in our favor for once. Caleb extended his hand. Thank you, William. I won't forget this. Don't thank me yet. We still have to win. Caleb rode back to the cabin on the 7th day, arriving to find Sarah and Emma anxious but hopeful. He'd sent word ahead through a messenger, but now he gave them the full story. We have evidence, he told them. Judge Harrison can hear the case in Helena. But we need to move fast. Pierce will be here tomorrow for your answer. When he arrives, we tell him we're challenging the debt and the contracts. Then we all travel to Helena for the hearing. When? Sarah asked. 3 days from now. Harrison's expediting everything. Emma looked worried. What if Murdoch doesn't show up? He'll show up. His pride won't let him ignore a legal challenge, and Harrison's made it clear that failure to appear will result in the debt being nullified by default. That night, Caleb sat with Sarah on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The spring air was cool but no longer bitter, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the creek running high with snowmelt. I'm scared, Sarah admitted. What if we lose? We won't. But if we do, Caleb turned to her, taking her hands. If we do, if everything goes wrong and the law fails us, I want you to know something. That money under the floorboards, it's yours. We'll pay Murdoch, and you'll be free. You and Emma can go anywhere, start fresh. I don't want to start fresh somewhere else. I want to stay here, with you. Sarah, let me finish. She squeezed his hands. These past months have been the happiest I've had since before Charles died. Maybe the happiest I've ever had. You've given us so much more than shelter and food. You've given us family. You've given us home. Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. I feel the same way. Then fight for it. Fight for us. Not because you owe us anything, but because this is worth fighting for. I will. I promise you, Sarah. I'll fight with everything I have. She leaned forward and kissed him gently. It was the first time, and it felt like a promise, a commitment to the future they were trying to build together. Inside the cabin, Emma pretended not to notice when they came in together, their hands intertwined, but she smiled as she sketched, adding their joined silhouette to the drawing she was making, a portrait of the family they'd become. Tomorrow, Pierce would arrive. The day after, they'd travel to Helena, and 3 days from now, they'd stand before a judge and fight for the right to choose their own future. The battle was coming, but for tonight, they were together, and they were ready. I've heard enough, Harrison said, but before I rule, I want to hear from Mrs. Mitchell herself. Sarah stood, her hands trembling slightly. Caleb wanted to reach out and steady her, but this was her moment. She needed to speak for herself. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice quiet but growing stronger. I didn't know about these debts. My husband kept many things from me. But even if the debts were real, even if he did sign those papers, I don't believe I should be punished for his mistakes. I've already lost my home, my reputation, nearly my life. How much more should one person pay for another's sins? The law, Pierce started, but Harrison silenced him with a look. Let her finish. Mr. Murdoch says I'm property because of debt, but I'm a person. I've worked hard my whole life. I was a teacher. I've tried to earn my way honestly. And when I had nothing, when my sister and I were starving, it wasn't the law that saved us. It wasn't the men who hide behind legal papers and manipulation. It was one good man who saw us suffering and chose to help. She looked at Caleb, tears in her eyes. Caleb Stone gave us food, shelter, and dignity when no one else would. He didn't demand payment. He didn't expect anything in return except that we be decent human beings. That's what mercy looks like. Not this. She gestured at Murdoch. not calling debt love or calling ownership marriage. Harrison nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. You may sit. Murdoch stood again, his composure slipping. Your Honour, regardless of sentiment, the law is the law. Those debts exist. The contracts are binding. Contracts signed by dead men? Harrison held up the forged document. Contracts created through deliberate manipulation and predatory lending? Mr. Murdoch, you've admitted to viewing Mrs. Mitchell as property to be acquired. You've shown a pattern of targeting vulnerable families, and now we have evidence of forged documents. I didn't forge anything, perhaps not personally, but these are your contracts, your business, your responsibility. And even if we set aside the forgery, the testimony we've heard today demonstrates a clear pattern of fraud and coercion. Harrison pulled out a leather-bound book, a law text Caleb recognized. Territorial Statute 47, Section 12, states that contracts obtained through fraud or under duress are void and unenforceable. Mr. Pierce, you're familiar with this statute? Pierce's shoulders slumped. Yes, Your Honour. Then you know that if I find these contracts were obtained fraudulently, they're worthless. Your Honour, Murdoch said, desperation creeping into his voice. You're making a mistake. I have influence in this territory, friends in high places. If you rule against me— Is that a threat, Mr. Murdoch? The courtroom went silent. Murdoch seemed to realize he'd gone too far, but couldn't stop himself. It's a fact. You're overstepping your bounds, Harrison. Blackwood would never— Judge Blackwood isn't presiding over this case. I am. Harrison's voice was steel. And I don't take kindly to threats in my courtroom. Murdoch lunged toward the bench, and for a moment Caleb thought he might actually attack the judge. But the bailiff stepped forward, and Murdoch caught himself. His mask of civilized respectability had completely fallen away, revealing the predator beneath. You can't do this, Murdoch hissed. She owes me. I've invested time and money in manipulating and entrapping a widow. Yes, we've established that. Harrison banged his gavel. Mr. Murdoch, I find your conduct in this matter to be reprehensible, and your contracts to be fraudulent. Therefore, I rule that all debts allegedly owed by Mrs. Sarah Mitchell to Clayton Murdoch are hereby declared null and void. The courtroom erupted. Sarah gasped, grabbing Emma's hand. Caleb felt relief wash over him like a wave. Furthermore, Harrison continued over the noise, I'm ordering an investigation into Mr. Murdoch's business practices. The territorial prosecutor will examine all of his loan contracts for similar fraud. If other victims are found, they too will have their debts nullified. This is outrageous, Murdoch shouted. I'll appeal. I'll take this all the way to Washington if I have to. You're welcome to try. But until then, my ruling stands. Mrs. Mitchell is free and clear of any obligation to you. Harrison looked at Murdoch with undisguised disgust. And Mr. Murdoch, I suggest you leave this territory while you still can. Because if the prosecutor finds what I think he'll find, you'll be facing criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Murdoch stared at Harrison with pure hatred, then turned that gaze on Caleb and Sarah. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Caleb said, standing. He pulled a pocket watch from his vest, the one Margaret had given him, years ago, the one he carried every day. He held it up so Murdoch could see it, then placed it deliberately on the table in front of him. This watch has been with me through war, through loss, through 8 years of grief. It's watched me survive everything life threw at me. And it's watching me now as I tell you this. If you come near Sarah or Emma again, if you threaten them in any way, you'll discover that some men are dangerous, not because they're looking for a fight, but because they've got something worth protecting. The threat was clear. Murdoch looked at Caleb, really looked at him for the first time, and seemed to see something that gave him pause. A man who'd been a cavalry captain, a man who'd survived war and loss, a man who had nothing left to lose except the family he'd found. Murdoch turned and stormed out of the courtroom, Pierce scrambling after him. The moment he was gone, Sarah collapsed into Caleb's arms, sobbing with relief. "It's over," Caleb murmured into her hair. "You're free." Harrison came down from the bench, smiling for the first time. "Congratulations. That was quite a fight." "Thank you, William. I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing." "But Caleb—" Harrison's expression turned serious. "Murdoch meant what he said. He's vindictive and he has resources. Watch your back." "I will." As they left the courthouse, stepping into the bright Montana sunshine, Emma threw her arms around both Caleb and Sarah. "We won. We actually won." "We did," Sarah said, laughing through her tears. She looked at Caleb, and in her eyes he saw everything he'd been afraid to hope for: love, gratitude, and the promise of a future they could build together. The battle was over. The victory was theirs. And for the first time in 8 years, Caleb Stone felt like he'd done something that mattered, something that made the years of grief and isolation worthwhile. He'd saved the people he loved. And in doing so, he'd saved himself. 3 months later, the mountain valley bloomed with summer. The garden that Caleb and Sarah had planned together flourished in neat rows behind the expanded cabin. Caleb had added 2 rooms over the spring, one for Emma to use as a proper studio, and one that would serve as a second bedroom, though lately its purpose had shifted toward becoming a library and sitting room. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Caleb work with a team of hired men on the framework of a barn. With Murdoch's threat ended and their future secure, Caleb had decided to make use of his land, a small ranch operation, nothing too ambitious, but something that would grow with time and care. Emma burst through the door, her arms full of canvases. "They sold, all 12 of them." "Emma, that's wonderful!" Sarah embraced her sister. "And Mr. Peterson at the art supply store in Helena wants to represent me. He says he has contacts with galleries back east, thinks my Montana landscapes could be very popular." Emma's face glowed with excitement. "Sarah, I might actually be able to go to art school this fall if I keep selling at this rate." Sarah felt both joy and a pang of sadness. "You'd leave?" "Not forever. Just for a year or 2, to study properly. Then I'd come back. This is home now." Emma glanced out the window at Caleb. "Besides, you 2 will need privacy eventually." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Emma." "Oh, please, you're not fooling anyone. The way you look at each other, the way he watches you when he thinks no one's paying attention. It's sweet, Sarah. After everything you've been through, you deserve happiness." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah and Caleb sat on the porch, as had become their custom. The summer air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. "Judge Harrison sent word," Caleb said. "Murdoch left the territory, went south to New Mexico, supposedly. The investigation found evidence of fraud in 17 different contracts. 8 families have had their debts cleared." "Good. He can't hurt anyone else here." Harrison also said the territorial legislature is reviewing the law that allowed those contracts in the first place. Might not change overnight, but at least people are paying attention. Sarah reached over and took his hand. "You started something important, Caleb. Not just for me, but for all those other families. We started it. You were brave enough to stand up in court and speak your truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge. Then Caleb shifted, reaching into his pocket. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the future, about what we're building here. And I realized something. This cabin, this land, all of it, it doesn't mean anything without people to share it with. For 8 years, I had everything I needed to survive, but nothing worth living for." He turned to face her. "You changed that. You and Emma. You gave me a reason to care again." Sarah's heart was pounding. She knew what was coming, had hoped for it, but hearing it still made her breath catch. Caleb pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring, not new, but polished to shine. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. I gave it to Margaret, and she wore it until the day she died. After that, I put it away, thought I'd never have use for it again." He took Sarah's hand. "But I was wrong. Sarah Mitchell, I know we've only known each other a few months. I know you've been through hell and might not be ready. But I'm asking anyway, because life's taught me not to wait for perfect timing. Will you marry me? Will you stay here, not as a guest or someone seeking shelter, but as my wife, as my partner in building this life?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, and Sarah felt 8 years of grief and 4 months of fear finally melt away, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. They married in August in the small church in Bent Creek. The town that had once shunned Sarah now celebrated her, shamed by their earlier judgment and impressed by her courage in facing down Murdoch. Emma stood as witness, along with Judge Harrison, who'd travelled from Helena for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, but beautiful. Caleb wore his cavalry uniform, pulled from storage and pressed clean. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn herself, with lace Emma had bought from her earnings. When Caleb lifted the veil and saw Sarah's face, he saw not just his bride, but his second chance, his redemption. That night, in the cabin that had grown from a hermit's refuge into a family home, Caleb and Sarah stood together, looking at the 2 Bibles on their shelf, the old worn one that had belonged to Margaret, and a new one they'd purchased together in town. Caleb opened the new Bible to the dedication page and carefully wrote their names, Caleb Stone and Sarah Mitchell Stone. Married August 15th, 1884. Below that, he added, Emma Mitchell, sister and beloved family. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. "I'm thinking about mercy, about how one decision to stop and help someone changed everything. I'm thinking about how broken things can be mended, how people who've lost everything can find it again." He closed the Bible gently. "I'm thinking that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them. And I'm grateful. For you, for Emma, for this second chance at life, for learning that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose hope over grief." Sarah kissed him softly. "I'm grateful too. For the mountain man who saw 2 strangers eating scraps and said, 'You're coming home now.' For the courage that simple kindness took. For everything that came after." Outside, the Montana night was peaceful. The valley slept under stars that had witnessed so much sorrow, and now watched over hard-won happiness. In the cabin, a family that had been forged from loneliness and despair settled into the quiet contentment of knowing they'd found where they belonged. Caleb had spent 8 years running from life, hiding from pain. Sarah had spent months just trying to survive, Emma had dreamed of a future that seemed impossible. Now, they had all found something better than what they'd lost. They'd found each other. They'd found home. And in the morning, they'd wake up and continue building the life they'd fought so hard to claim. Together, they'd plant and harvest. Together, they'd face whatever challenges came. Together, they'd prove that mercy and courage could overcome injustice, that broken people could heal, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. As Caleb extinguished the lamp and pulled Sarah close, his last thought before sleep took him was simple and profound. He was home. After 8 years of wandering in grief, he'd finally come home. And it was good